Good afternoon. Welcome. I'm Arian Mack, and I'm the organizer of this conference and a professor at the New School for Social Research and editor of the journal Social Research. It's a pleasure to have you here today at the first session of our conference, Unknowability, How We Know What Cannot Be Known. Please allow me to begin by saying a few words about social research, which has been the journal of the New School for Social Research since 1934. When it was launched by Alvin Johnson, the New School's first president, along with the small group of exiled scholars whom he had with great foresight and effort managed to bring out of Germany to the New School to protect them from the impending savagery that was beginning to unfold there. This remarkable rescue effort had an added singular value for this new institution. It enabled it to create a very prestigious graduate faculty in the political and social sciences in one fell swoop. Most of those Johnson brought here had already lost their academic positions in Germany with the imposition of racial laws. This group became known as the University in Exile in 1933, and in 1934 it changed its name to the Graduate Faculty of Political and Social Sciences. And more recently, it changed its name again to the New School for Social Research. It was Alvin Johnson who believed that the faculty needed a journal which could be its public voice. And it was to serve that goal that he and the small group of exiled faculty began social research. And it was with that in mind that we initiated the Social Research Conference series in 1988. So it's been going on now a long time. I would like to beg you to allow me a brief digression just to tell you about something that relates to what I just said that I think is almost a miracle. This past September, with a great sense of pride and amazement, the New School launched a new version of a university in exile. Something that is as badly needed now as it was in 1933. The new University in Exile is a consortium of universities and colleges based here at the New School, which at its outset in September had 10 members, that is university and colleges, and now has 15, and we expect it to continue to grow and we hope to flourish. In fact, if your university, that is the university you went to, is not a member, and you would be willing to urge them to join, we would be grateful. So not completely unlike the original mission of the early 1933 University in Exile, our mission is to nurture and protect the exiled scholars and their intellectual capital that they bring with them. Now, so that's just an aside, but something I wanted. I like to spread the news whenever I can. Anyway, thank you, and do encourage anyone you think would be interested and is attached to a university to consider joining. Now back to the conference series. Our mission from the start has been to foster discussion of matters of serious public concern by exploring them in terms of their immediate import and, whenever possible, within their historical and cultural contexts. Papers from the conference and almost all the previous 37 conferences in this series are published in special issues of Social Research. This one will appear as the spring 2020 issue, which you can order in the Social Research table in the lobby. We began the series in '88, and since 2010, the conference series has been organized under the auspices of our Center for Public Scholarship here at the New School. now to say something about the choice of subject. From the earliest moments of humanity's search for answers and explanations, we have grappled with the unknowable, that which we are unable or not permitted to know. This conference explores how we decide that something is unknowable rather than merely not yet known. What criteria do we use in determining that some knowledge is beyond our reach? And do these criteria differ across fields? What does the history of the unknowable look like? What are the questions we once thought to be unanswerable that have been answered? Are there enduring unknowables? Are there routes towards understanding that are different from those used by scientists? And what's the status of the knowledge gained through those alternate ways of knowing? The question of what it is we cannot know is not only an important question in its own right, which it certainly is, but has taken on additional importance in light of the recent rise of misinformation and alternative facts. A better understanding of knowing whether something can possibly be known has the capacity to shape the direction of general knowledge, scholarly research, and public education. Furthermore, identifying what kinds of questions are unanswerable is of great intellectual and perhaps even political significance. To wit, Donald Rumsfeld's now famous statement that there are known knowns, there are known unknowns, and there are also unknown unknowns, to which Finian O'Toole added, as well, there are also unknown knowns. This proposed conference affords a rare opportunity for scholars from very different fields to engage with each other and with the general public on this issue, particularly at a time when we're living at what has been called a post-truth world. Now we are about to begin, but I'd like to thank the National Science Foundation that provided the funding that has made this conference possible, and to thank Alex Kizalewski, who also made this conference possible. Without the NSF and without Alex, this wouldn't have happened. One small and disappointing announcement. Those of you who came with the hope of hearing Rebecca Goldstein today, unfortunately she's sick, and she lives in Cambridge and was just too ill to travel, and she sends her regrets. And I also apologize that we couldn't get the word out, because we just learned this morning. It is now my pleasure to introduce Jim Miller, my colleague and moderator of our first session that focuses on the humanities. Jim is a professor of politics and liberal studies and faculty director of the master's program in creative publishing and critical journalism at the New School for Social Research. His latest book, Can Democracy Work? A Short History of a Radical Idea from Ancient Athens to Our World, has just recently been published by Farrar, Straus, and Giroux. He's twice been a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award for Nonfiction and has won 3 ASCAP Deems Taylor Awards for excellence in writing about music. He's written in many well-known journals and magazines, and was editor of Daedalus, the magazine Daedalus, for I think 8 years. And now it is my great pleasure to turn this over to Jim.
Thank you, Arian, not only for your introduction, but also for the incredible work you've done for so many years in organizing these invaluable conferences and also editing Social Research. As Arian just explained, it's the flagship publication of the New School for Social Research, and a very fine publication it has been under your stewardship. Thank you all for coming out this afternoon. It's a great turnout, given that it's actually a pretty balmy day outside. And welcome to this first panel of the 38th Social Research Conference on the topic of unknowability. Immanuel Kant begins the first edition of his seminal 1781 treatise, Critique of Pure Reason, with a sentence that summarizes a dilemma faced by almost all scholars at some time in their scholarly life. Human reason, writes Kant, I'm citing Norman Kemp Smith's classic English translation, quote, human reason has the peculiar fate in one species of its knowledge, it is burdened by questions which is prescribed by the very nature of reason itself. It is not able to ignore, but which, transcending all its powers, it is also not able to answer. In making these remarks, Kant was only confirming a main current of the Western philosophical tradition. After all, Plato, in his dialogues, also dramatized the mythic life of the first person to be called a philosopher, a lover of wisdom, namely Socrates. And this mythic figure, as Plato reimagines him for us, was a thoroughly vexatious fellow who abhorred the customary social lubricant of idle chatter and favored instead a systematic and very public contravention of received opinions, often producing not knowledge, but what Cicero called paradoxa, his Latin rendering of the Greek cognate. In other words, Socrates, according to Plato, pursued wisdom in part by punching holes in Athenian windbags. But how else might we discover the limits of what self-confident people think they know? Or even more ambitiously, as in the case of Kant, the limits of what we as a species can possibly know. And what might be the result if the search for knowledge were to devolve into an endless demonstration of paradoxes, rather than producing any trustworthy results, however provisional? The answers to such questions, I suppose, will depend on the nature and objects of our inquiries. Separate panels tomorrow will address the challenges in mathematics and the natural and social sciences. As someone who sometimes teaches students who aspire to become journalists, I myself sometimes wonder if we are all fated to live in a world of shadowy assumptions, unwitting hostages of unexamined convictions, unrelenting propaganda, and our own all too human propensity to settle for snap judgments and clever paradoxes. But our concern this afternoon is neither with the sciences nor the cave I fear I may be stuck living in. It is with the humanities. We'll be hearing today from three scholars accomplished in three different fields: literature, history, and archaeology. They are each to speak for about 20 minutes in order to leave plenty of time for questions and comments, both from the panelists themselves, but also from the audience. And when it comes time for questions from the audience, there'll be microphones at the front of the theater here, which I see are set up, and we'd like you to queue at those microphones to ask your question. But to start, and in order to get the formalities out of the way, I'll now introduce all of our speakers in the order in which they will be speaking. Dame Marina Sarah Warner is president of the Royal Society of Literature and professor of English and creative writing at Birkbeck College, University of London. Her many books include Alone of All Her Sex, The Myth and the Cult of the Virgin Mary, Once Upon a Time, A Short History of Fairy Tales, Stranger Magic, Charmed States and the Arabian Nights, and a new essay collection, Forms of Enchantment, Writings on Art and Artists. She's currently working on a memoir of her childhood in Cairo and a study of sanctuary and literature. Michael Scott, who will be discussing how little we know or conceivably can know about the Oracle at Delphi, is a professor of classics and ancient history at the University of Warwick in England, In 2017-18, Professor Scott held a Leverhulme Research Fellowship to work on ancient global history, a big research project, looking at the movement of luxury goods between the Mediterranean and China and antiquity. He is a National Teaching Fellow. This is the most prestigious award in the UK for teaching in higher education, and a Senior Fellow of the Higher Education Academy. More pertinently, Professor Scott in 2015 was made an honorary citizen of Delphi, Greece, in recognition of his research on the ancient sanctuary there. I do not know if this entitles him to answer your riddles after the lecture is over. He is also well known as a speaker and broadcaster, having presented a range of TV programs for National Geographic, History Channel, Nova, BBC, and ITV, so if he looks familiar, that's why. Zoe Crossland is Associate Professor of Anthropology at Columbia University, and she'll be analyzing in her paper later how archaeological traces, because most of them don't operate in the register of language, may offer us insight into the mediated nature of all knowledge, past, present, or future. Professor Crossland's research focuses on the historical archaeology of Madagascar and on forensic archaeology and evidential practices around human remains. She is interested in how archaeologists evaluate competing claims about the past, and she is currently working on a book entitled The Speaking Corpse, which explores the evidence of the forensic body, the ways in which it is explained and delineated for popular consumption, and the history that lies behind the treatment of the dead as evidence. It's going to be an exciting afternoon. So without delay, I turn the floor over to Marina Warner, whose paper is entitled Unknowability and Pleasure, the Case of the Vanishing Referent.
Good evening, or good afternoon, and thank you all very much for coming, and thank you for your introduction. And above all, thank you, Arian, for inviting me back to the new school. I'm very, very happy to be here, especially as Eric Hobsbawm was here for many years teaching and is now very much the subject of discussion in England because a new biography has come out of him, about him. In 1943, during the Blitz in London, the Anglo-Irish author Elizabeth Bowen wrote a short story, Mysterious Core. It's become one of her most admired and best-loved writings. Core, exotically spelt with a circumflex over the O, sounds like the core of something, and indeed in the story it inspires yearning to reach it, an ultimate elsewhere. A pair of lovers, Pepita and Arthur, he's on leave from the war, are adrift in the empty city with nowhere to go. The moon is full, and London eerily, implacably illuminated. In the story, as Pepita walks with her lover at night through a London rendered spectral by the blackout and the air raids, she finds core in her mind's eye, taking possession of her. But the word also conjures for the reader a ghost city which cannot be reached or known either. Frustrated, exasperated by the littleness of the here and now, Pepita transposes herself in her mind to core. Bowen's story is spiky, reproducing in its jagged, interrupted scenes and brusque relations the enigma of the imaginary lost and enchanted city, where Pepita later drifts in her restless dreams. Bowen found core in the 1886 novel She by Rider Haggard, a torrid creator of imperialist adventures, including King Solomon's Mines. His virulent fantasies epitomize the passionate repulsion and attraction of the British for the territories they and others invaded and took possession of, which they also often saw as female. Core is a queendom of Haggard's Aisha, who has passed through the fire of eternal life, but at the arrival of the hero crumbles into dust. Bowen read the book when she was 12, and in a radio talk in 1947, she singled it out as the turning point of her life. The book, she said, stands for the first totally violent impact I ever received from print. After print was to fill me with apprehension. I was prepared to handle any book like a bomb. The concept of core communicates all the heady fin de siècle mixture of women, death, desire, beauty, exoticism. Haggard was riffing on the lost cities of the desert in the 1001 Nights, and especially the tale called The City of Brass, where everything is stilled around the effigy of its queen, mummified with her eye sockets filled with quicksilver, so she looks alive, and guarded by automata who slice off the head of anyone approaching her body to take the jewels that cover her. She's a speaking corpse. Bowen also likewise invokes territorial ambitions of the empire, but Kor, the matriarchal ghost city, lies beyond our reach. These associations hover in the story, and the effect is highly charged, thrilling as if live adrenaline were being delivered from the Haggard novel via Bowen's moonlit scenes into our nervous system as we read. I was a little girl when I read Haggard avidly, including She, and later saw the 1965 film, which perhaps some of you will remember too, in which Ursula Andress shatters into that pile of dust. In that radio talk, Bowen goes on to make the crucial point that it was not the woman who attracted her, not ever really she who must be obeyed, who controlled the magic. It was the power of the pen, the inventive pen, that was the revelation. Mysterious core, conjured by Bowen's own inventive pen, exemplifies the unknowability that beckons to writers, artists, and composers. If it can be captured in words or images, it carries intense powers of suggestion and constitutes a whole territory of aesthetic frisson and delight. The argument I'm trying to make belongs in a theory of cognitive responses. Opening a window onto the unknowable reveals how language breaks through far beyond data, breaks through the epistemic border, to create beings and things which cannot be verified, but nevertheless experienced. It sharpens epistemic vigilance, or should do, drawing attention to the creative power of language itself. Also, because the forms of unknowability I'm going to look at lead to emotional states, including surprise and delight, ideas of affect theory also apply. And the works I'm going to turn to excite responses that I hope you'll agree can make you shiver, gasp, and smile inwardly and even outwardly. As Jonathan Swift declared, this is an exercise in comic energy, in the will to live. He wrote, I am now trying an experiment which is very frequent among modern authors, which is to write upon nothing. When the subject is utterly exhausted, let the pen still move on, by some called the ghost of wit, delighted to walk after the death of the body. From the Bible to nursery rhymes, much-loved stories and poems are filled with words, images, and illusions which are baffling. They may have once meant something that was generally known and understood, or they may have begun as pure nonsense, but in either case, they have acceded to a state of unknowability, close to impossibility. As the Queen in Alice Through the Looking Glass exclaims, why, sometimes I've believed as many as 6 impossible things before breakfast. I can only give you a rough sketch, a foul paper, and I know I shall be trampling on rich fields carefully drilled and seeded and planted by philosophers, linguisticians, and philologists. I'm also aware that to be at a loss in a morass of unknowability can be very unpleasant indeed. In the UK, Brexit is showing us that. And the maze of incomprehensible documentation into which refugees and asylum seekers find themselves also adds greatly to their ordeal. But I'm trying to grasp a countervailing form of unknowability, a zone of aesthetic and literary pleasure. And I'm going to single out 3 forms of this state on a rising scale of deliberate unintelligibility. First, nursery rhymes offer a case study in expressions which no longer convey knowledge of what they once meant, if they ever meant anything at all. Playfully, they create unknowable scenes. Secondly, works of wild acoustic improvisation, such as Edith Sitwell's Facade, set to music by William Walton, was first performed privately in 1922. And this sequence of poems and songs displays virtuoso gymnastics of tongue-twisting, riddling, concatenations of images and names and words, properly structured according to syntax and grammar, but purposefully dizzying and bamboozling. Sense flits by, half-glimpsed, fugitive, and when it does assemble into some kind of mental object, its meaning can't be grasped. It is what it is, not anything known or knowable. Thirdly, a classic work of iconoclastic imagination, the Dadaist Kurt Schwitter's Ursonata, which dispenses with words almost completely for a performance of meaningless virtuoso babble, which still releases, I hope you'll agree, a blast of joyous, liberating energy. Incidentally, this is a point I would like to make at this point now. The aphorism about known unknowns and unknown unknowns, which has been so widely credited to Donald Rumsfeld, has been done quite erroneously. I heard it years before in a talk given by Robin Grove White, who was then the director of Greenpeace. And the phrase was circulating in environmental circles of activism, interestingly enough. And the whole history of the phrase is very well documented in The Politics of Catastrophe, Genealogies of the Unknown, a book that was published in 2011. I just want to make that clear. We don't need to credit it to him. He doesn't need to be. His name does not need to appear. Creating unknowable scenes by acts of imagination serve multiple literary and intellectual purposes. It opens epistemic borders, as I said, and flouts causality and reason. It consequently acts to increase epistemic vigilance at alerting the reader or listener to realms beyond understanding. It flourishes the promise of ungraspable mysteries made by language, but beyond all known languages, beyond Babel. It offers a chance to exhibit virtuoso ingenuity in making verbal music and provokes physical responses. The pleasures of the light fantastic are given permission, and this is a faculty of our story-making species. It also sobers us up. Its inventions gesture towards the infinite conjugations of languages and sounds once delivered into the liberty of unknowability. The poet Susan Stewart, in her study of nonsense, published in 1980, very early in her career, commented warmly on the infinity of possibilities that making up offered. Although she doesn't place it in the landscape of unknowability as such, her analysis of nonsense flourishes this prospect. All these forms of play with infinity, nesting secularity, the series and the causal chain, are ways of showing the infinite connectability of all things and the arbitrariness of most connections, the mechanics of the composability that is textuality. The problems of where to begin and where to end are placed in a paradoxical context of timelessness that is the fictive universe itself. How many miles to Babylon? 70 miles and 10. Can I get there by candlelight? Yes, and back again. If your heels are nimble and light, you can get back there by candlelight. Scholars can hunt down the origins of such rhymes, but when you discover that the fine lady on a white horse was so-and-so, or that Lewis Carroll had X in mind when he summoned the fabulous Jabberwock, the mysterious core-like character of the verses remains undiminished. Yet these forms of literature, including fairy tales, riddles, and proverbial phrases, deliver a frisson of mystery and of absurdity that is often memorably sensuous and enticing. Hey diddle diddle, the cat and the fiddle, the cow jumped over the moon. The little dog laughed to see such fun, and the dish ran away with the spoon. The examples of artifacts made by known authors, that I'm now going to turn to look at more closely, were created very near each other in time during a period in the early 20s when artists in all media set out to shatter complacency, disrupt received decorum, and explode aesthetic convention. Edith Sitwell's facade has its detractors, as does Edith Sitwell herself, who was her own principal artifact, presenting herself as a highly wrought portrait, her unusual long features elaborately jeweled and coiffed, and photographed by numerous famous photographers. Facade is carefully named. It is highly artificial and mannered, and somehow resolutely Mandarin, high society and highfalutin at once. But in defense of this now rather overlooked work, I would say Sitwell consciously fashions a double-edged solemnity and heightens its prancing eccentricities by exaggerating her languid society airs on purpose and gleefully mocking herself and the elevated social class that she belonged to. As she wasn't trained to be a singer, and she deeply resented her lack of education at all. Deemed as a girl, her class didn't believe in educating women. Her voice was too weak to be heard above the orchestra, and she therefore used a megaphone from behind a curtain, adding a twist to the general mischief of the event. Here is Sitwell performing Trio for Two Cats and a Trombone in the 1953 recording. Yes, yeah. I got it. This is Long Steel Grass.
Long steel glass, the white soda sparse, the light is braying like an arse. See the tall Spanish jade with hair black as nightshade, worn as a cockade, flee. Her eyes gasconade and her gowns parade, as stiff as a brigade. Tee-hee. The hard and braying light is zebra black and white. It will take away the slight and free. Tinge of the night organ sound, oysters for no swooping round her flanges as they sweep the ground. The trumpet and the drum and the martial calling come to make the people dumb, but we won't wait for stifled night, moonlight, water, milk white bright, to make clear the declaration of our Paphian location beside the Castanetti sea, where stalks Il Capitano, swagger, braggadocio, sword and mustachio. He is green as a cassava, and his hair is an armada. To the J, come kiss me harder, he poured across the battlements the she. Heard our voices thin and shrill as the steely grasses thrill, or the sound of the Ionica when the folk has the pica in the palace of the Queen Chinese.
The sequence of poems pays homage to Anglo-Saxon riddles as well as... Oh, it's got to stop. To Anglo-Saxon riddles, as well as to children's verses in the English tradition, from rhymes and ditties, skipping songs and ball games and catches, to the limericks of Edward Lear and the parodies of Lewis Carroll. To this vernacular legacy, Sitwell mixes in lots of loan words and quirky proper names that give her the opportunity for witty rhymes. Don Pasquito, but Sitwell isn't derivative. She has her own distinctive ear and a remarkable facility for making new shapes with words.
With glory to step up the laureate's feet, moving in classical meters. Like balaclava, the lava came down from the roof, and the sea's blue wooden gendarmerie took them in charge while Beelzebub roared for his rum.
Hornpipes and the tarantella and yodeling, other more contemporary, popular vernacular music, pasodobles and waltzes and foxtrots and polkas, a contrast to the frequently recondite devices of the words. The resulting suite is packed with atmospheric, mimetic swoops and glissandos, rhythmic changes of pace and meter, chasing internal rhymes, and every trick of the verbal sound palette, onomatopoeia and assonance and alliteration, and they're all there in a controlled madcap profusion. About 30 years after Fassade's earliest performances, Noam Chomsky invented a very famous sentence, coherent but ultimately meaningless: colorless green dreams sleep furiously. And this has a Sitwellian ring, though it's not quite as barbed or dandyish as her writing. After listening again and again to the sequence, certain themes do emerge. Hell is there, and there are many heavens elsewhere in exotic, sunny, distant places, all of them mysterious cause. Characters make repeat appearances: Lord Tennyson, Queen Victoria, lots of exotic animals, and a whole host of fanciful black and oriental figures who, like Eliot's Madame Sosostris and Haggard's She, inhabit the realms of the beckoning unknowable. And Sitwell would certainly repay some serious analysis along Orientalist lines. You would be very hard-pressed, though, to summarize what's taking place. Is there something there which can be grasped or known? The most celebrated song of all is the closing one, Sir Beelzebub. And this is Constance Lambert, Peter Pears, singing in 1953.
When Sir Beelzebub called for his syllabub in the hotel in hell where Proserpine first fell, blue as the gendarmerie where the waves of the sea, rocking and shocking the barmaid. Nobody comes to give him his rum, but the rim of the sky hippopotamus glum enhances the chances to bless with a benison. Alfred Lord Tennyson crossing the barley with cold vegetation from pale deputations of temperance workers, all signed in memoria, hoping with glory to trip up the laureate's feet, moving in classical meters. Like balaclava, the lava came down from the roof, and the sea's blue wooden gendarmerie took them in charge while Beelzebub roared for his rum. None of them come.
The Dadaists took the primal nonsense syllables for their movement's name, doubling the sound as babies do. And in the same decade as Facade, Kurt Schwitters, who's a ecologist and artist, as you know, pressed further into the territory of the unknowable. He was inspired by a poster poem his friend Raoul Hausmann, had made the year before, 1918, using random sequences of letters sampled from a page of type fonts. This strange beast came out with the unreadable and unpronounceable title, as you see on your screen. If this cluster of letters were notes of music, we, the audience, would not feel that something knowable was being deliberately withheld from us. But because these Dada works are made of language, not music, the relation of linguistic expression to communication of sense and knowledge is severed to explosive effect. The wonderful eruption of sounds, the ursonata, leads to an improvised cadenza for the performer in each performance. And it takes the idea of gobbledygook in a different direction towards inspired, expressive, utter gibberish with no precise references in sight or earshot. It's 38 minutes long and a tour de force for any singer. One or two of the repeated sound clusters do form knowable concepts. Rakati is a rocket, for example, revealing the ursonata's relationship with some of futurism's ambitions for the modern world and the machine, and an affinity with vorticism as well. Schwitters also mixed into his sonata shortened inscriptions on company plaques and on printed matter, but especially inscriptions on railroad switch towers, which always sound so interesting because one has no way of understanding them. The resulting tragicomic, unfamiliar music has a strange expressiveness, an array of responses from jubilation to fury. Schwitters performed it himself by heart and improvised a new cadenza each time, and in this sense, the piece was unknowable until it was newly performed. One early recital took place in Potsdam at the invitation of a private patron for her friends, the highest-ranking old country gentry of Prussia. Hans Richter, the filmmaker and artist, was present and wrote afterwards how when Schwitters began to perform, complete with hisses, roars, and crowings, he was watching the old Junkers in their white ties and tails. At first, they boggled at what they were hearing and tried to contain themselves, but soon they went pink, then puce, then blue, until finally one could not control himself any longer, and with his sudden burst of laughter, the whole audience could not contain itself. Schwitters crescendoed, drove his voice to rise above the uproar, and reasserted his command of them. The result was fantastic, wrote Richter. The same generals, the same rich old ladies, who had previously laughed till they cried, now came to Schwitters again with tears in their eyes, almost stuttering with admiration and gratitude. Something had been opened up within them, something they had never experienced to feel, a great joy. So here we have a little bit of him.
Seiner Sonate mit Urlauten. Der Bebe, fünf, Bebe, fünf, te, fünf, te, zeu, vergib, vi är. Det sänder i en betuto du ka. Rintsäkete bibi hinskarmu, tiu hinsetio rinskarmu, rakete bibi. Rum tufto, tiu hinsetio hinskarmu, tiu hinsetio rinskarmu, rakete bibi, rakete bibi.
I think you get the idea, and I think it's pretty unknowable. It continued to have extreme and wonderful impact on listeners. George Melly, who was an English performer, jazz musician, writer too, found himself one night alone in the small hours in a city far away, and he was set upon by muggers. They thought they had an easy mark on their hands. I think he was pretty drunk. But Melly began to blast out the Schwitter's Ursonata, rising to a great crescendo, at which his attackers took to their heels. So Schwitters had set out to capture primal sounds, and the effect certainly strikes the listener as something from the bubbling mud of time, the emergent forms of language, words struggling to appear and promising significance, but withdrawing sense to fall back on visceral, emotional states of being, a wide and wonderful range of them, playing our listening bodies like instruments themselves as we judder and thrill and smile and shrink to the noises the performer is making. It delivers us into the playground of the state before knowledge forms, and there is a pleasure in being there. These kinds of absurd concoctions, contrivances, and sound actions have gained point today, I think, because certain conditions of contemporary life have increased the recognition they inspire and the liberation they offer. And you could say that this is a kind of knowledge, a knowledge of our own ignorance and helplessness. The global traffic, movement of peoples, and the World Wide Web have intensified the Babel-like hubbub around us. Traveling on the tube in London or the subway, surfing the web, we encounter many more languages than ever before. In the last 2 years, I've heard languages spoken in Sicily whose names I did not even know before: Bambara, Fula, and Wolof, widely used languages in West Africa, which is where most of these refugees in Sicily are coming from. Deriving pleasure rather than fear from the unfamiliarity can be thought of as a powerful transformative stratagem, by analogy with tragedy, which turns horror and calamity into an audience's emotional and aesthetic satisfaction. Such works reel us into their toils in ways that help us relax into strangeness. They also exhilarate because they suggest the infinity of permutations possible in sound systems and potentially languages. Furthermore, in relation to digitization, these exercises in unknowable meanings make startlingly original clusters and patterns with words and sounds. I'm told by a friend who is far more cybernetically agile than I am that encryption, so essential to transactions on the web, is constantly striving to attain a state beyond knowability to prevent the code being cracked. If this is the case, the human capacity of generating unknowable mental objects, such as a cow jumping over a moon, or Sir Beelzebub calling for his syllabub, might be considered a desirable and unique mark of our imaginations and minds, a space of distinctiveness from the robot. Thank you.
To tell us more about historians who think about the unknowable, I turn to Michael Scott, whose paper is entitled The Oracle at Delphi, Unknowability at the Heart of the Ancient Greek World.
Thank you very much indeed for the welcome. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you for the invitation to come and speak with you today. I'm Marina, one of your descriptions of the bubbling mud of time that you came up with there is kind of where we're going next into history. Although perhaps my first description of history won't be anywhere near as enticing as the bubbling mud of time. History, in fact, was once famously described as just one damn thing after another, an endless list of events. In many ways, such a characterization of history masks the possibility of unknowability. Events seemingly are known about, and there's just far too many of them. Yet, of course, to define history in such a way would be to sell it very short indeed. The canvas of our human past is vast, varied, and complex, existing in an infinite number of simultaneous events, a similar number of perceptions and interpretations of those events, as well as a wide range of reactions and decisions emerging from them. And I'm getting the feeling that infinity and the infinite might be a really interesting theme that we want to pick up on here in relation to unknowability this afternoon. As such, there are plenty of unknowns in history. And in response to that vast canvas of inquiry, historians have had to prioritize. Not all unknowns, it turns out, within the discipline of history, are created equal. The study of history, I think it's fair to say, has coalesced as a result traditionally not around the poles of unknowable versus not yet known, and not even around the poles of known unknowns and unknown unknowns, whoever we attribute that quote to, but rather, I would argue, around unknowns we would like to know versus unknowns we don't currently think it's important to know. Now, how each of these categories of unknown featured and dealt with unknowability is very different. Indeed, in relation to the first category, the unknowns we would like to know, I would argue that historical study has traditionally left very little room for unknowability. This is essentially because of the process of writing history, which allows for the creation of authoritative visions of the past, in many ways independent of the degree to which the past is known or unknown, and the independent of the degree to which that vision itself is provable in any recognizable scientific sense. So let's just run through how historians do their thing, particularly in relation to unknowns we would like to know about, to understand that process a little bit more clearly. And then I want to move on to exemplify that through talking about the oracle at Delphi. So on any given topic, the historian consults the evidence surviving from a range of different types of primary sources and tries to form a picture of what happened, how those events were understood, and their consequences. But to do so crucially involves the active judgment of the historian in weighing up a range of sources which may well be, and often are, in my case in terms of ancient history, in conflict with one another. And all those sources are not created equal either. Some will be judged more authoritative and useful than others, perhaps because they're closer to the topic in question, either geographically or temporally. Others will be given greater weight as more authoritative based on who produced them or through which source material they have been handed down to us. And rarely are any of those decisions clear-cut. Thus, each historian exercising their judgment on what sources they choose to listen to and prioritize will often create a different picture of the past based on the same set of sources. And in addition, there's almost never going to be enough surviving evidence to fill the gap of the unknown that we would like to know about completely. So the historian's job is then to turn towards creating an argument for how they think we should fill that gap. They might seek to argue that we could fill it by comparing what we want to know about to a similar period, event, or idea elsewhere in time and space, for example. And most often they will do that in conjunction with the visions that have been produced by previous scholars working in the field, the secondary scholarship as we call it, offering arguments as to why they agree with some and not with others, expanding or reworking aspects of previous visions to produce what they feel to be the most compelling version of events. Now, these versions of events, these visions of the past, cannot be subjected to any kind of scientific process of proof because they're based on arguments, suppositions, and ideas about a topic which is only known through a patchwork of often uncertain sources and which never existed anyway in one single form, but which from its inception was understood and remembered in multiple by the different people taking part in it and recording it. So instead, historians' visions for how we should understand the past acquire their authority through a process of debate, judgment, and acceptance by the general historical community based on what is considered most reasonable and convincing. Visions may be discarded as less convincing than previous attempts to fill the gap, or they may be accepted, replacing those previous visions of the topic, or they might find a place alongside a number of visions for how we should understand that topic, each of which are favoured by different collections of historians for a variety of different reasons. And so the process goes on, without any necessary end. A historian's vision for an aspect of the unknown in our past only stands for as long as it's not successfully challenged. Or as the saying goes, only the future is certain, the past just keeps on changing. As such, we need to acknowledge that in writing the story of the past and in accepting particular visions of it, historians are not only creating, challenging, and agreeing with visions which are themselves melting pots of facts, opinions, judgments, arguments, and assertions, but they're doing so, like it or not, subject to their own likes and dislikes, prejudices and preferences, just as the wider historical community is subject to wider disciplinary and societal pressures, fads, perceptions, and views, all of which weigh in on what vision of the past comes out in the wash as the most accepted or authoritative. Now, while we've made great strides in recent decades towards clearer articulation within arguments to distinguish between facts, opinion, argument, and while more widely historians strive to be more objective and aware of the wider biases and influences acting on them, it is, I would argue, impossible within history to ever be completely objective. The knock-on impact for that method of operation is twofold. Crucially, just as there are rarely unknowns which historians would be willing, I think, to classify finally as fully known, job done, no more to be said here, find me a historian who will ever say that about perhaps any work except their own. There's always an acknowledgement, I think, implicit within the study of history that a topic could be better known and understood, particularly given our understanding that every event in the past was perceived and understood in an infinite number of ways anyway. But historians, I think, have also traditionally, within the category of unknowns they would like to know about, rejected the existence of a concept of unknowability. Because a vision of any particular aspect of the past which interests us can and has always been created through a process of weighing up the surviving sources and supplementing the framework they offer with argument and discussion to produce a more or less whole vision which potentially goes on to find authority and acceptance within the wider scholarly community and which achieves, as a result, a status of sort of quasi-knowledge. But in relation to the second category I outlined at the beginning, the unknowns we currently don't think it's important to know, historians have conversely been much more willing to accept a concept of unknowability. Now, this category is composed most obviously of the periods, people, groups, ideas, movements, places which historians have chosen not to investigate because they have not considered that topic of interest, importance, or relevance. Indeed, scholars have often justified that disinterest via a claim to its unknowability. There's no point investigating this because there's no surviving evidence. And indeed, in a nice example of circular argument, the claim has often been made that because there's no or very little surviving evidence, this must have been a topic of little importance for the time period, and thus it's not necessary for us to study it or know about it. So examples here of these kinds of histories might be of course, minority and non-elite groups, of particular races, of women, of slaves. In relation to my field, the historical study of the ancient world, for example, the study of the role, position, and rights and ideas of women in antiquity has only come on to the mainstream scholarly agenda in the last 60 years, thanks to the changing attitudes and opportunities in our modern society. As such, this category of the unknown, once not of interest and often claimed unknowable, has moved to become part of the unknowns we would like to know about, and subsequently been studied in the format I outlined, with the result that we have realized it was not as unknowable as had previously been claimed. And there's a certain hypocrisy, I think, implicit in the way we do history as things move between those two categories. Now, the movement of topics from the second category through to the first clearly tells us as much about ourselves as it does about the past. What we choose to study and not to study, to label as an unknown that we would like to know versus one we're not interested in investigating, is an implicit statement of values by the period and society undertaking that historical investigation. In short, the unknown in history and the degree to which we are willing to admit unknowability in history is often a mirror for ourselves. It forces us to reflect on the roles we play in constructing the narratives of our past. So to demonstrate and exemplify these points, I now want to offer a brief case study of the oracle at Delphi. For some of you aren't familiar, here we are in Greece. We're here where the arrow is pointing. This is Delphi, up near the Parnassian Mountains. We are roughly 600 meters above sea level, very near to Greece's only ski resort on the top of the Parnassian Mountains. And here in Albert Tournair's 1891 beautiful reconstruction, we get a sense of the jewel that was the sanctuary of Apollo at Delphi, nestled in the crags of the Parnassian Mountains. A absolutely stonking, gobsmacking, overloading collection of gold, silver, ivory, marble that would have taken the breath away of every ancient that saw it, as well as, of course, many of the moderns who come there today. At its heart, inside the main temple you can see in the middle of that image, was the oracle at Delphi. And the oracle at Delphi in ancient Greece, which was active between the 8th century BCE and the 4th century CE, so 1,000 years odd, was one of the most powerful and well-respected sources of knowledge about the future in the ancient Mediterranean world. People came from far and wide to consult a female Pythian priestess, as she was known. There she is on the left, sitting, I always think, rather uncomfortably on her tripod, to find out how well disposed the Greek gods were towards them and their plans within a worldview in which the gods could be actively for you and actively against you, and you most definitely didn't want the Greek gods against you. Yet it's also one of the ancient Mediterranean world's greatest mysteries, one of its greatest unknowns, because not a single source survives from antiquity, from that 1,000-year period, that describes the entire process of consulting the oracle at Delphi. Instead, we have a patchwork of sources that give us aspects of the process and which often disagree with one another, dotted across that 1,000 years. As such, the oracle at Delphi definitively fell into my first category of unknowns, unknowns we would like to know about. It's too important an institution within the story of the ancient Mediterranean world to pass up. So how have we gone about answering the unknown, the mystery? Well, in the run-up to the late 19th century, the most well-known and accepted explanation of how the oracle at Delphi worked related to stories told in the chronologically later Roman-era sources. People like Strabo and Diodorus Siculus, who wrote of a chasm in the ground from which vapors emerged, which caused frenzy, and which once breathed in caused the Pythian priestess, who was said to sit on a tripod above the chasm, to prophesize. The image of the Pythian priestess breathing in these mysterious vapors coming from the ground, and as a result falling into some kind of frenzy or trance, and then giving her response to the consultant's question as if possessed or inspired by the god Apollo, became popular far and wide outside of academia. This is John Collier's 1891 painting of the priestess at Delphi. And you can see those vapors emerging strongly. Now, two factors conspired at the time to make this picture of the oracle at Delphi the most authoritative. Remember, the chasm and the vapors are really only talked about in a few of the many sources that survive, giving that patchwork of ideas about how the oracle at Delphi worked across over 1,000 years. The question becomes, why have we decided, or why did we decide, to put such emphasis on those sources in particular? Well, first, I think we did it because historians in the West were traditionally more willing and interested in buying into Roman-era sources than to earlier Greek ones, right? We have traditionally had a greater affinity and desire to kind of identify with what the Roman world thought about things than necessarily the Greek world. You will be well familiar with this, Jim, from looking recently at democracy, from the many, many centuries for which we have bought into the Roman description of Greek democracy as little more than mob rule. Just have a look at some of the founding father debates of the Constitution here in America, and you will see ancient Athenian democracy described as mob rule. Even if every Athenian citizen had been a Socrates, Athenian democracy would still have been a complete and utter shambles. Right? So it's described. But second, because particularly in Britain, in the US at the time, so we're talking here in the 1880s, 1890s, there was a huge fascination with the occult. In 1882, academics, including Lewis Carroll, we've already heard about him today, and Alfred Lord Tennyson, founded the Society for Psychical Research. And in its first journal volume, it called for a detailed examination of the ancient oracles, especially at Delphi, in order to gather evidence for the long-enduring existence of the supernatural. In May 1891, the same year excavations at Delphi began to uncover the ancient sanctuary for the first time since it had been lost and covered over in the 7th century AD, a burlesque opera entitled Apollo, or the Oracle at Delphi, opened here in New York at the Casino, the first American theater built specifically for musicals, and it was a smash hit, according to the New York Times theatrical gossip column of April 30th, 1891. However, in the ensuing investigations in the following years, and here we have the remains of the Temple of Apollo as they stand today at Delphi, no chasm was found during the excavations within the temple. No chasm. No gap in the floor, no space for vapors to emerge, no frenzied trance. Some scholars simply refused to believe it. They refused to believe the excavational reports. Zoe, I can see, is champing at the bit at such an idea. Other scholars sought alternative forms of physical inspiration for the frenzy of the priestess that might work instead of vapors. A German scholar, Professor Oesterich, took practical archaeology to new heights by chewing vast quantities of laurel leaves, which have been alluded to in another one of those fragmentary sources about how the oracle at Delphi worked, to see whether this induced any kind of inspirational effect. Disappointed, he declared himself, and this has to be one of the possibly the greatest academic quotes in history, he declared himself no more inspired than usual. Others sought psychological causes for the Pythia's inspiration. In the 1940s, E.R. Dodds, who was the Regius Professor of Greek at Oxford and president of the Society for Psychical Research, argued that the oracle was a potential example of telepathy in antiquity. But by the 1950s, the French excavators of Delphi has always been excavated principally by a team of French archaeologists, suggested that the Pythian priestess was actually just a front for a collection of clever male priests at Delphi who came up entirely without divine inspiration or the responses. In short, Delphi was a cunning con trick. The Pythia was a fraud, a front, a mouthpiece, and nothing more. What caused this move to recharacterize Delphi as a con trick? Well, scholarship focused much more widely on Greek philosophical thought, culture, and politics had during the 19th and early 20th centuries decided, giving up finally on its preference for the Romans, to elevate the Greeks to become a new prime ancestor of European culture. It had thus sought to craft the ancient Greeks in their new position as the newly accepted privileged ancestors of Western culture as the ultimate example of rational beings, and thus as an example of a sophisticated rather than primitive ancient society. And the very definition of rationality and sophistication that was proposed and imposed on ancient Greece, deriving from that Socratic search for truth and fact through the continual questioning of assumptions, the popping of windbags, as Jim described it, until one reached base principles, left little room for the occult, for tales of the supernatural, for telepathy. The oracle at Delphi could thus not be the beating heart of a rational, sophisticated society and a mechanism of psychic inspiration at the same time. The only way Delphi could remain a key institution of this rational, sophisticated ancient Greece that everyone wanted was for explanations of the oracle to drop comparisons to the occult and to be understood instead as a clever con trick operated by men, thus also conforming to the need to deprioritize the place of the Pythian female priestess and thus maintaining the role of women as unimportant in the study of antiquity. Now, this status quo, amazingly, remained pretty much the accepted authoritative version until the 1980s, 1990s. By this time, wider re-evaluations of the rational and irrational, as we might describe them in Greek culture, the nature of Greek religion, and a wider understanding of how Delphi operated had opened up a number of avenues for arguments that allowed scholars to mix elements of conscious manipulation and genuine belief with models of spirit possession, together with a revised understanding of the role and importance of women within ancient society, to create a new, more mixed picture of how the oracle operated. And to this, in the early 2000s, you will be pleased to know, we also needed to add new geological evidence that hallucinogenic gases were, in fact, present at the surface at Delphi. The vapors were back, and they're back in the story. So as such, to conclude, the example of Delphi as a critical institution of the ancient Greek world and as an example that has chimed at different times with key modern era interests has always been an unknown we would like to know about. But the visions created and accepted as authoritative by the wider scholarly community for how the oracle operated have varied widely, sometimes in response to the discovery of new evidence, or in rather the absence of evidence, but mostly they have changed in a response to changing attitudes towards ancient Greece, the occult, and to women. And to this day, and I think always, Delphi thus challenges us to realize how much we are involved in the stories we tell about the past, and to question the authority of the stories we tell ourselves. In short, ironically, as an institution dedicated in antiquity to making the unknown known for the ancients, to tell them about their future, Delphi, for us, reinforces the fact, I think, that we need to create greater room in historical study for the limits of our knowledge and for unknowability itself, especially in relation to the unknowns that we would really like to know about. Thank you. Thank you very much.
We turn finally to Zoe Crossland, whose paper is entitled Unknown but Not Unknowable, the Past and Its Semiotic Reality.
Thanks, everyone, and thanks especially to Ariane for the invitation to talk today. Well, Michael, after you threw down the gauntlet like that, dissing archaeology, I feel like I have to try and rescue something. I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to do it, however. I want to talk today about Neanderthals. This isn't my own area of research, so I'm really sort of pushing at the limits of what I know here, but Neanderthals, as anthropologists like to say, are good to think with, and I think they're particularly interesting to think about in relation to this question of unknowability. So I'd like to start by just asking you all to reflect for a moment on how you picture a Neanderthal. Bring one to mind. What's the image in your head? How do you picture body posture? How do you think, how do you see skin color, hair, gender? Just try and visualize that Neanderthal for a moment, and we'll return to it later at the end of the lecture. The deep archaeological past is fundamentally unknown in the sense that none of us here have experienced it or can experience it. And yet somehow we come to know it, or at least we make claims to know it. So how does that happen? And what is the role, or what are the role of material traces in this knowledge production? How does material evidence recraft knowledge? How does it enter into discourse? When the Neanderthals were first discovered and identified in the second half of the 19th century, something novel was found. Something that was previously unknown and the unknowable came into view. After the first recognized Neanderthal skeleton was found in the Neander Valley in 1856, it took the next 50 to 100 years for our familiar idea of another human species wandering the late Ice Age landscapes of Western Europe to coalesce. And what's interesting about this is what it reveals about this relationship of the known to unknown. It's not a zero-sum situation where we pile up what is known on the one hand while what is unknown decreases. Instead, with knowledge comes forms of unknowledge. Once the bones were recognized as potentially human, then a whole world of possibility for knowing opens up, yet all of which remained unknown. So this shows us, on the one hand, how material traces can force themselves into recognition. They can prompt a recalibration of what is known. But of course, we can also see how the Neanderthal could only be known as a Neanderthal at a particular moment of space-time. 500 years earlier, or even 50 years earlier, its bones would have been dug out and discarded if they were found at all. So it's with Darwin and with Huxley that people start to think about possibilities that the Neanderthal could be an evolutionary antecedent. Others fitted it into racialized typologies prevalent at the time, using race to think about the non-human. So in this sense, archaeological evidence can certainly always surprise us and force us to recalibrate, but only within a particular framework of expectation. So Neanderthals are interesting in terms of this question of the unknown in relation to the possible. How is the field of the possible imagined, and how is it constrained? Today we know that Neanderthals occupied an area that extended from the south of Great Britain as far away as the eastern Mediterranean and far east towards Siberia. Modern humans and Neanderthals inhabited the same European landscapes from around 50,000 years ago, seems to depend on who you read, until they disappeared approximately 28,000 years ago. And I want to show how even with this present state of knowledge of the field, there's a lot more obviously known about Neanderthals today, the field of the possible continues to constrain and to shift. And I want to sort of think about this field of the possible. So when something becomes known, a whole constellation of possibility opens up. But that constellation itself is predicated on collateral knowledge and understanding of what is available to knowledge, as Michael was just explaining. So if the Neanderthal was unknowable and unthinkable prior to 1856, when the first one was identified, once its bones were found, they revealed a whole world that was previously unthought of, unknown. Who would have thought that another human species once walked around Europe? To imagine this possibility, though, it had to be scaffolded onto contemporary knowledge of human difference. It had to be scaffolded onto concepts of evolution and of race. And a key moment was the analysis of the Neanderthal skeleton from La Chapelle-aux-Saints by Marcelin Boule. It was found in 1908. And his interpretation characterized it as brutish, with a curved spine, with knees bent, with a head that jutted forward. Really, the whole view was of a creature with a general lack of intelligence, animal-like. More recent analysis by Eric Trinkhaus has shown that the poor skeleton from La Chapelle-aux-Saints had terrible osteoarthritis. And that could well have had something to do with the way in which Poole reconstructed the skeleton, but it's not reducible to this. He's shown that even with the osteoarthritis, the skeleton should not have been reconstructed as so stooping, and Boole even suggested that the Neanderthal had an opposable big toe, like the great apes, but there's actually nothing in the osteology that leads to this interpretation. So we get this notion of the Neanderthal as sort of nasty and brutish, and of course this was consistent with ideas at the time that you could read off intelligence and humanity in relation to the body. And what is also interesting, I think, is the way in which this image of the Neanderthal has persisted through the 20th century. And clearly it speaks to something in popular understandings of evolution. So Boole could never have imagined that today, for example, the Neanderthal genome would be sequenced, or that we'd be taking cheek swabs to discover that many of us have Neanderthal ancestry in very tiny amounts. We know much more about Neanderthals now. We know something about diet, regional difference, but there's still much that's contested. And for a long time, debates have gone on over the question of language. Did they have language? Or burial, did they bury the dead or not? These have been very contested topics. And what's interesting about this is the way then in which Neanderthals exist in this interesting place, where there's a lot that's neither known nor not known, right? There's archaeologists in both camps who will argue, yes, they buried the dead, or no, they didn't. They had language, they didn't have language. We don't really know for sure. And I think archaeologists have a certain comfort with speculation, with that gap between the traces that we excavate and the past that we reconstruct from them. The question then is, how do we scaffold out from those traces? And which links are stronger and weaker, and how do we assess those relative strengths? So I'm interested then in how the unknown is imagined as the possible, and how this offers a framework. We could, of course, do a kind of classic sociology of science study here, and we could think about the ways in which the bones of different Neanderthals are networked with other elements in a sort of Latourian framework. And indeed, this has been done by David van Riebeeck in a very nice short article in Antiquity. So he talks about how different scholars, their articles and textbooks in which their ideas are disseminated are all sort of linked, and to the extent that a particular image of the Neanderthal has persisted through the 20th century. But instead, what I'd like to talk about is, I'd like to look closely at how Neanderthal remains are interpreted as signs of something else. How are traces interpreted as evidence of an unknown past, and how are they made sense of? How are they scaffolded so that we have this kind of imagined penumbra of the possible, and how is that also constrained? So we can start with the skeleton. In many ways, this acts as a kind of metonym for all the other Neanderthals that would have been walking around. It's convincing because we take it as an index of the body in life. Its material connection to the living, breathing Neanderthal. And this also, so it has this living connection, and that means also that some trace of that living Neanderthal still exists with us today in the present, just in the same way as Neanderthal DNA continues to exist. So this kind of indexical sign is particular to space and time. It's the kind of trace that's privileged in forensic investigation. It can be used to argue that this individual died and was deposited at this time, in this place, in this way. There's a very specific kind of inquiry. It's all about the individual biography and the specifics of time and place. But how do we move from knowing about what happened at this particular moment with this one individual to knowing about that much wider social and ecological world that this Neanderthal inhabited? Indexical signs really have a very limited range of possibilities that can be attested to. This is both their strength and their weakness. They're directly produced by the actions and events of the past. We can put a lot of faith in them for that reason, and they're very powerful for making truth claims. But then we have to think carefully about how we then generalize out from those traces. So, for example, this is a recent study that's come out where archaeologists have found traces of wood in the dental calculus of Neanderthals. This example is pine, I think. And it comes from Spain, from northern Spain. And one of the things I want to do is to try and figure out how does this wood get into this dental calculus? How did it end up in the teeth? So one of the ways they do this is to look at other indexical evidence of wood chomping, right? So you see that through the teeth wear. If you're chewing a lot of wood, your teeth are going to wear down quite significantly. That's another form of indexical argument, right? That wood is wearing down the teeth. But they also make an argument by analogy, through similarity. You do this by searching for other human societies that have similar kinds of practices or that eat similar materials. The interior of pine, in some cases, can be eaten. And then you look to see, again, what sort of indexical traces or marks are left on the teeth by this action. So taken together, you're taking a sort of relation of similarity with an indexical relationship, and you're to argue that this Neanderthal was manipulating wood based on this indexical trace that's left in the mouth. But this argument of similarity is also very important for interpreting that trace. And then, of course, we make another argument of similarity to say that this wasn't an individualized act of this particular Neanderthal, but it was done more widely. And again, in making this kind of argument of analogy, we're on much less certain ground. But we have to speculate in this way in order to say anything interesting. And archaeology is really all about pattern anticipation and pattern recognition, as well, of course, as recognizing those moments when patterns are subverted and changed. So as we inductively establish the shape and extent of the patterns, we start to establish patterns of past habitual behavior. So we start to think more generally about the practices that Neanderthals might have been involved with that involve processing woody materials. At the same time, we establish particular habits of inference. We start to have patterns of ways of thinking about these Neanderthals. For many years, right through the second half of the 20th century, and today to some extent, less so now, there was a debate about what kind of analogies to use for Neanderthals. One argument was that Neanderthals aren't even particularly good hunters, and instead that they survived by scavenging the animal carcasses that had been left by more sort of powerful predators. And this argument about whether Neanderthals scavenged or whether they hunted, about whether they buried their dead or whether the dead Neanderthals had simply been buried accidentally, these are arguments about what kind of analog should be used. Should humans be the analog or should animals? Effectively, they're debates over the status of this creature. Is it human or is it animal? And depending which view one subscribes to, you get a very different field of possibility opening up. As more remains have been found, then they have to be fitted into these fields of possibility. And in so doing, the fields both narrow and also expand. And to give you another example, recent research has shown that Neanderthals were cooking plant foods. They found evidence of date palms, legumes, and also grass seeds. And the seeds from the grass seeds show damage that's characteristic of cooked food. So it's very interesting because this really, in many ways, takes them out of the realm of the animal and sort of, as it's usually conceptualized, and sort of inserts them fully into the field of possibility for the human. So in some ways, while that field of possibility is narrowed down because of these traces, we know that they cooked plants and that therefore they undertook an activity that we tend to think of as characteristic of humans. At the same time, new fields of possibility now open up. Instead of talking about the Neanderthal diet, can we talk about Neanderthal cuisine? How do we imagine their humanness? How do we really start to reconceptualize what it is to be a human Neanderthal? Many of the analogies that we have recourse to go unexamined. We're drawing to a great extent on our own experiences of the world to think about the possible, and we're also drawing upon established traditions of scholarly analysis and thought. Another recent study, very interesting, has shown that at many sites where you find Neanderthals, you also find widespread use of corvids, that's birds from the crow family, and raptors as well. And what they've discovered is that from these cut marks on bones, that they seem to be extracting the large flight feathers from these bones. So there's a real interest by Neanderthals in birds that have these very dramatic feathers. And they suggest that perhaps it's a form of adornment or dress or adornment for Neanderthals, which again really starts to open up different possibilities for thinking about what it is to be a Neanderthal. So with these new indexical signs, these are all sort of indexes, right? The cut marks on bone, for example. We open up different kinds of evidence and different kinds of relationships. We open up new relationships with other Neanderthals, with humans at the time as well, with material culture, with landscape, with diet, and also, of course, with us as the people that are doing the interpreting work around these bodies. So for a long time, the work on Neanderthals has focused on questions of hunting versus scavenging. Archaeologists didn't think too much about plant use. And now we're starting to see, a whole new sort of field of possibility opening up for rethinking diet in terms of cuisine, for thinking about dress and adornment, thinking about gender, all sorts of aspects of what it is to be human that we can possibly imagine around the Neanderthals. And I just want to finish by saying that it's very hard to fully conceptualize this field of the possible. We're operating in it all the time. It's really underspecified. We can certainly pin down some elements, right? We can think about analogies that we use, whether it's for hide working or for woodworking with the teeth, things like that. But much is left unexamined. And I asked you when I began to sort of imagine a Neanderthal, and this was really to sort of start to think about the field of the possible that we're all inhabiting right now, because I think here is where we get a glimpse of how that field of the possible is constituted. And what I've done here is I went to Google and did a quick image search for Neanderthals. And what's really interesting is if you look at the full first page of results, the predominant view of Neanderthals are like this. They're gendered male. We're still operating within a very 20th century view of history and agency in a field of possibility that's undefined, but still constrains at the same time. So although these are representations that have been made, obviously by media companies, they're based on archaeological reports, and clearly archaeologists have not been thinking about gender, so we default to the universal male gender, which is very interesting. So I think just to finish, I just want to point out that in fact we can use this way of thinking about scaffolding based on indexical signs and sort of bringing together these other similar analogues to actually think more generally. It's not something that's really restricted just to archaeology. It's something really that operates much more generally in the process of knowing. And I think, we know through such evidential signs all the time, and it's much broader than a purely academic question. Thank you.
Well, I want to thank all three of you for a really very stimulating series of talks that I think raise some interesting issues. I want to make a few comments and then invite you to talk among yourself. The first comment is about Neanderthals. 23andMe, my wife thought I really had to have my DNA tested. This is a new form of knowability that I'm not particularly interested in. And the results came back that I have more Neanderthal traces in my DNA sample than 99% of the database. So when you ask me to, imagine a Neanderthal, I remember looking in the mirror this morning. The second comment I want to make, which struck me particularly about Marina Warner's and Michael Scott's presentations, is that the focus is in both of your papers, it seems to me. There's a certain analogy in that Marina is looking at artworks and texts that defy easy understanding and have been deliberately organized, I think, to solicit multiple interpretations. So there is a kind of artistic literary production that is meant to be mysterious and mystifying rather than to be easily legible, and that's quite deliberate. And the analogy to the Oracle is that Michael Scott is describing an institution, and there are many such institutions that was deliberately designed to be mysterious, shrouded in secrecy, organized to resist public accountability. And so the challenges of trying to know something where efforts have been made to conceal and shroud it in secrecy, that's an important feature of the human condition, and it's with us still because of the large number of government functions that we citizens know absolutely nothing about, probably a far larger percentage of public policies than in any previous time in history. The third comment is that it's directed and is sort of inspired by Zoe and Michael's presentation, and that both of you, because you're interested in the past, are grappling with a paucity of evidence, a lack. Whereas I was struck in writing my book, Examined Lives, which went from short biographies of ancient philosophers to modern philosophers. And when you deal with ancient philosophers, we don't know much, and there's a paucity of evidence. We get to modern philosophers, for example, Friedrich Nietzsche, we know way too much. We're flooded with evidence. It's an excess of evidence. And the assumption that an excess of evidence is a good thing for knowability seems to me to be false, that we actually are drowning in information, and that's become an increasingly salient aspect of the modern condition. And it just occurred to me as I was listening to the talks to make that comment. But enough of my responses. Please, if you have other thoughts you would like to share among yourselves of what you've heard, and then we'll turn it over to the audience.
Well, I would like to ask you both, actually, something which I think, though our talks were rather disparate, I think there is a connective tissue, which is that though you didn't actually invoke imaginative constructions as such, they are rather important. And in the present situation, you ended with the internet and reconstructions of the faces, and there's a huge amount of reconstruction of ancient Greece in any number of media. But they share category differences. So some of them are presented as historic reconstructions, and some of them are presented as imaginative reconstructions, as in films or even in productions of Greek plays. But so I'd like to hear you both actually talk about that role of, where is the distinction for you? I mean, Herodotus, the great Greek historian, is hardly, hardly evidentially based. I mean, this is, isn't it? It's a very, I mean, there's a huge amount of imagination in Herodotus. So, how do you conceptualize that? And what is the purpose for you, or the value for you, of I, Claudius, or Robert Graves' great reconstruction? Or, I mean, there's so much of that. And Delphi, heavens.
Yeah, well, I can speak a little to the archaeology. I mean, I think the reconstructed faces of the Neanderthals are really interesting, because I think, as an archaeologist, you feel a little bit uncomfortable with them because they go so much further than you feel able to do based on the evidence that you have. And this is also an issue for forensic reconstruction, where people do, make sort of reconstructions of faces based on skulls that have been found of missing individuals. They have to try and make them look as sort of neutral as possible while also being recognizable. So there's this really interesting work that goes on with this kind of facial recognition, where you're actually pinning down the field of the possible in a way that we don't normally do. And of course, the moment you do that, you open yourself up to the possibility of being horribly, horribly wrong. Which I think, that's one of the things that's sort of so interesting, I think, for archaeologists, that we're very happy sort of living in that sort of field of the possible and not necessarily getting pinned down too much on all aspects of it, because that's where a lot of the interesting sort of motivating dimensions of the work come from, right? That from living in that sort of slightly imagined, not real but not unreal world of possibility. Yeah.
Just picking up on that and a number of points that have been made, I think that you described that the positive power, yes, of the infinite number of possibilities that are out there. And I think history, and to some extent archaeology, has kind of gone from a place where there was a correct way to see the past, there was a truth, there was a historical truth somewhere, to thinking about the past as an infinite number of possible views, interpretations, and understandings of any particular event. And as a result, not being able to talk about a true, a single way to view a particular moment, and is struggling still as a result to deal with the infinite. That within that place, and it's a little akin to the overwhelming amount of evidence that you related to. What do you do? On the one hand, you're overwhelmed with evidence, but equally, if you're overwhelmed with a number of possible ways in which a situation could be understood or looked at or studied, how do you, as a result, produce a narrative, a story that is swallowable, that is understandable? And I think that just what you alluded to there is that kind of academics spend their time in the area of possibility, the area of doubt, the area of perhaps and maybes, and that's how we square that circle of dealing with the infinite. But the moment you turn towards trying to create a narrative, particularly for public dissemination, I mean, my experience, I don't know your experience, my experience is that the moment you turn towards writing a book which is intended for a wider general audience, or particularly if you're producing a TV documentary, is that there is no space for maybes, possibles. There needs to be an iron thread of narrative and of a story without doubt and problem. So I think that's kind of one of the issues that we need to grapple with a little.
I mean, it really is a contemporary issue, because I think one of the problems of, we were asked to think about fake news. I think one of the problems is that we generally have an attitude to the internet in particular, that it is a realist and objective medium that is telling this reliable story. And that's why there's so much consent and belief of crazy claims and lies on the internet. And if we actually developed a little bit more of a deep sympathy with the amount of imaginative concoctions that form the past, that form our ways of thinking about the past, then we would have more vigilance. This is the point I was trying to make, more vigilance about what we are fed. It's because there's this mass media desire to be kind of seamless and unquestionable, authoritative and knowable, the very fiction of knowability that rules it, makes us far too supine in how we relate to it.
I wonder how you would relate what you've just said to the Mueller report. Would you like the Mueller report to be open to all kinds of infinite possibilities and uncertainties, as it apparently actually left a core uncertainty over whether obstruction had been... I mean, this actually is a serious question, because it's a good example of a old-fashioned, fact-driven forensic investigation into what happened based to the greatest extent possible on eyewitness testimony, some of which will conflict. And it seems to me there's a hunger in the modern period for a restoration of authoritative, reliable sources of verifiable information. And so I feel there's a real tension here in the celebration of infinity and imagination and a thirst that actually is historically, politically consequential.
But the Mueller report is extremely well defined as a forensic document.
Yeah.
The categories matter very much.
Yeah.
I mean, if it was a poem, then we would have a very different relationship to it.
Yeah.
I mean, it's very important that we understand those distinctions, and people tend to try and obscure them. I mean, it's...
I think that blurring of the boundaries, that obscuring of the boundaries across the different categories that we need to put our heads into
Yes.
when we decide what we, kind of are content with in terms of the unknown is very important. I mean, in Britain, as I'm sure in the US, we hear endlessly about kind of it's the end of the era of experts. We don't need experts telling us things anymore. Right. Kind of, and we have Brexit, as a result. But I think there is a rejection of traditional authoritative sort of places where you go to get information, and yet there is nothing, as you rightly point out, that has yet filled that gap, as opposed to this idea that everyone's opinion is in somehow valid and somehow equal.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a big and complicated question, but two things sort of occur to me. One is that obviously when the Mueller report, if and when it's published, it will open up huge fields of possibilities while closing down others. And much of the debate that will go on will be around the sort of rigorousness of the traces that are documented in that report, how indexical they are, how they really make these claims to the real and to the truth. So that's one dimension. And then the other dimension, I think, in relation to authority is the way in which the sort of model of authority, because of the way in which facts have been imagined as something that's sort of separate from interpretation, that means that the role of the interpreter becomes very, very important. And so then if you have suspicion of the interpreter, if you are suspicious of their motivations, their political motivations, therefore you're not going to believe the facts that they're interpreting for you. So, the issue around fake news and all of these issues around not trusting facts, I think is very closely tied to the model of fact and representation that we've been operating under for a long time.
So, do you want to take questions, or do you have other comments you want to make?
I just wanted to follow on from that.
Yeah.
I think there's even a more implicit danger in allowing facts to stand as a single category. Because
Sure.
I mean, I'm thinking here in terms of ancient history, where we are with looking at the sources. And you mentioned Herodotus. He's known as the father of history and the father of lies simultaneously. Yes. So here we have a source that we happily label as evidence, and an evidence we already have associations in our head that tend towards fact. When actually what we do is we have a single person's viewpoint and take on the past. In terms of Herodotus thinking about how the great powers of Greece and Persia came into conflict with one another. So all of those sources, those evidences that we have thought about in the past as our stable stuff that we can build, our foundations that we can build on, are themselves just as liable to be labeled interpretations as the modern scholars that come along and add to that.
Right.
But I would like to go back to I want to press you a bit on this idea of fictional reconstruction in things that are categorized as fiction. Okay. So they're not categorized as forensic evidence or documentation or archaeological reports or historical sources. They are categorized as invented artifacts, but they have often a very long reach. I mean, in the sense that, when you asked us to imagine a Neanderthal, most of us would have not been doing it from archaeological reconstructions, but from films.
Right.
I mean, or possibly films, or even graphic novels now.
Yep.
Or, I mean, these are very dominating epistemological windows. And they have, because of the way we think, the way the human mind is made, they impinge very strongly. We've almost all of us had the experience that when you've read a novel, a beloved novel, and then there's a television series of it, your image of the hero and heroine is superimposed with, whoever it may be. Keira Knightley,
Well, you could do worse.
But I mean, it is, no, I don't mean it's, I'm delighted to think about her, but it's just that it's an imposition on because one's image-making faculties on one's own are not as strong as the images that are fully delineated and enfleshed in film. I take that from cognitive theory.
Yeah.
I mean, I think there's a really interesting example here that I've been grappling with myself in that, as you alluded to, split ancient Greece and ancient Rome very, very differently. If I ask you all to imagine, not the Neanderthal, but if you imagine ancient Rome in your heads, I think we can all do it very, very easily. You have a centurion, you have a gladiator, you have a Colosseum, and it's kind of like today, but less technology and a bit dirtier. But we can do it, right? We can imagine and fill a world of ancient Rome that we can buy into. If I asked you to do that about ancient Greece, I hope you would agree that actually becomes a lot harder. That either it's the Parthenon or it's a Spartan soldier kind of fighting at Thermopylae or something like that. Or it's a bearded philosopher kind of sitting there stroking that beard going, But actually filling that place world is very difficult. And that has a knock-on impact for how then fictional programs, documentaries as well as but films as well are made. Films about ancient Rome have been quite successful. Think of Gladiator, etc. Try and find me a film about ancient Greece that has actually been a success.
The 300.
And the 300 is
Animated.
It's an animated graphic cartoon. There is no example of a film about ancient Greece that has met with public box office success because there is this problem, this gap, this unknown about what really that we think of as the ancient Greek world. We can't imagine it as real, and thus we can't buy into any representation of it.
But I mean, I was completely turned on when I was a child by Helen of Troy, which I think is in the 50s.
Yeah.
And it was one of the very first films I ever saw, and the title, her name was Helen of Troy, and then it burst into flames. I mean, this ignited my passion for myths.
That's great.
Absolutely. I mean,
I think my experience, interestingly, also with TV commissioners, is that it is 2 or 3 times as hard to get a commission about ancient Greece than it is about ancient Rome, because the commissioner feels that the public have an affinity with ancient Rome that they do not have. They do not have that understanding and link to ancient Greece, and thus will not be as interested in and feel that a program about ancient Greece is for them as much as a program about ancient
I'm at this point completely stuck on the fact that we have a reference both to Kurt Schwitter's and Helen of Troy on the same panel as works of imagination. Thank you.
well, look, actually, H.D. was the same period, did a marvelous poem on Helen of Troy.
Yeah.
I mean, these are long-standing inspirations.
If we're going to get questions from the audience, I think now is the time. So if you have questions for the panelists, if you'd please come forward to one of our 2 microphones. And if you could identify yourself, that would be helpful.
Thank you. It is said that the difference between a journalist and a historian is a journalist is a historian who is in a hurry, in a rush. And I understand that Napoleon Bonaparte said that history is a set of lies agreed upon. So maybe he read Herodotus. I think maybe it'd be better to say that history is a set of institutional lies that are put forth by an intellectual bodyguard who are paid for by the institutions or whose agenda aligns with that, with those institutions. My question is this: is that...
This is for Professor Scott, I assume.
Yes, yes. But it's also for anybody who studied the ancients, is that we've studied, I don't care what state of form of government that you've studied, there have always been oppressive governments, and they've always put forth their agenda as far as history. I'm curious as to if there are any lessons in the ancient world with regards to fake news or to fake history, and how to determine what is the correct history, or how do you go about what the established narrative is in your field, and then you go ahead and you do revision on it? Because basically what you're doing is you are overturning the institutionalized lies that were put forth before, and you are revising the history.
Everything is fake news now.
Okay. You ready?
Well, I don't know if I'd go as strongly as you have in claiming that every generation creates a set of lies about the past. I would put them forward as stories that are bought into and believed in of the period and of the era because of the world in which the people creating those stories are living. We write our stories about the past to reflect, and they reflect where we are at the present. So I would see that as history is being told and retold, is being presented and represented, represented by each generation, rather than as a need to overturn lies that are told in the past. In terms of kind of, are there any examples from antiquity about how they dealt with fake news? Actually, it is a fascinating question, because you have almost no authorities of knowledge and of history. Right? Herodotus is writing at the end of the 5th century BCE, and he writes his narrative, but he is delivering it standing on the steps of the Temple of Zeus at Olympia during the Olympic Games. And he's just one voice, of which there have been many historians, philosophers, political pamphleteers, all shouting their own opinions at the same time. There is no such thing as a place to go to get authoritative knowledge in antiquity, except, ironically enough, a place like Delphi. A place where you could either go because then the knowledge somehow you believed came from the gods, and thus had divine authority. But equally, if you were in the human realm and you wanted something to stick as definitively having happened and having been important, one of the ways you did that was to build something architecturally or sculpt something artistically and dedicate it within a sanctuary like Delphi, because once it was there, it could never be got rid of because it was the property of the god. And so Delphi became this sort of monumental storybook of the past, that if it was there in the sanctuary, it must have happened. To the extent that cities would come along centuries later, keen to represent their history of the past and mock up a monument that looked like it was 200 years old and dedicate it within the sanctuary at Delphi and insert it into that monumental story. So even that would be manipulated.
Sorry, did you?
No, please.
I just wanted to add something in defense of the humanities, which of course is our panel, because though I agree with you that ideology often leads knowledge, or the quest for knowledge to some extent, it is one of the factors that is worth defending of present universities, is that they are meant to be, and they actually are, forums for free discussion, and that's what we must maintain. And there is a lot of disagreement, especially about history, within the universities. And Eric Hobsbawm, who I would like to invoke again, said it was absolute nonsense to say that history was always written by the victors. He said the best history is written by the losers. And that is what's actually interesting about the turn that you were talking about, which is we are interested now in what we can excavate about the history of slavery, the history of women, the history of the effaced voices from the past, which have been remarkably well actually excavated. We have now quite a lot of testimony that it was just previously overlooked because people were not, as you said, were not actually looking for that evidence because they weren't asking those questions. But the humanities can sharpen our attention to the questions that need to be asked. And that really is a principle of education we have to defend.
And I think those university institutions actually have to defend that in two directions increasingly. One is perhaps towards the institutions that you were referring to that are trying to control that authority, sort of single narrative. But equally, there are multiple smaller groups, political groups, social groups that are trying to use certain aspects of the past incorrectly. And I think it's part of the job of academics as well to get involved in that discussion. I mean, in relation to the ancient world, there's been recently the creation of the Pharos project that sits there to categorize, to sort of make a list of and document the uses and misuses of the ancient world as exemplar for justifying modern current day activities. And so kind of there you have academics seeking to actually try to police the use of the ancient world in two directions.
I believe there's even a move, some sort of bizarre white nationalist move to claim Neanderthal identity in Europe as well, as some kind of originary identity for Europe. Yeah, so you can't escape it.
I just want to say on behalf of ancient Greece, they had a lot of academies and not just the Oracle at Delphi, just to remind us of other sources of authoritative information that did appear eventually. Yes, sir, and your name, please, and your question.
Hi. Oh, very loud. My name's Willie. I have a question regarding the Oracle of Delphi. So I'm curious what the context is now around it. I wonder if the fumes are back, but more seriously, what the context around mediumship and trance is around plant medicine. To give you some context, during my undergraduate days, I wrote an incomplete thesis about spirit mediums and trauma mitigation in post-colonial Mozambique, say 1960 to now. And there's an article written by a Portuguese colonial administrator mentioning a plant called parama, but there was also a movement in northern Mozambique during the war called the Naparama movement. There's very little chance of a coincidence. So I'm kind of wondering what the current context is around that. And maybe you can speak of this from a Mediterranean context. You might know of other contexts as well.
Where we are with the Oracle at Delphi, well, yes, the vapors are back, or at least ethylene has been proved to be in the surface water at Delphi. So if you do go to Delphi, don't drink the water there without thinking. You might be ingesting ethylene gas, which is a hallucinogenic gas, but is also what was used for anesthesia, actually, right up until the 1970s. Stopped then because it turned out to be quite explosive. But people struggle with how far that, or indeed if one considered any other kind of material forms of hallucinogen, where that gets us. You get a Pythian priestess high, and how do you mar that picture with the fact for 1,000 years people from all over the ancient Mediterranean world hiked up to this place to receive responses that were considered useful enough, authoritative enough, on message enough to keep people coming back. And so people are still trying to bring together those two pictures, and it's done through kind of a number of different ways, trying to mix and match the different aspects that we've created before. So I think kind of while the search continues on the one hand, and no doubt there are more kind of wannabe German professor Osterrichs kind of who are chomping different things to try and find perhaps an answer to that aspect of the question. It's never going to be an answer to the whole question of what made Delphi so valued in antiquity.
Right. I think the bigger question is what has these local healers and authorities continue to be relevant in the age of developing governments, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. So I'll table it with that.
Can I just add something anecdotal, which is that Tony Harrison, who's one of the great poets in English, in England and in English, and much influenced by the classics, and did some wonderful reconstructions of the Oxyrhynchus manuscripts, goes every year to Delphi to drink the waters of the Castalian spring.
Yeah, I was wondering if you had tested the vapors and how intrepid you really were in your inquiry. It seems you haven't yet.
It's part of the taking on the honorary citizenship. Breathe it in. And
we'll talk later. And if you could give us your name, please, and ask your question.
Okay. My name is Olga, and I would like to first say about Neanderthals. A couple of years ago, I found out it probably was at its seminar at Columbia. They were saying that Neanderthals had bigger brains than modern human after compare their skulls and our skulls. And so what do you think about this theory that they extinct not because they were stupid but smarter? But my question is this maybe the time when historians start to develop alternative histories. For example, like in one history, like Alexander the Great was a hero, in another history he was just a murderer. What do you think? Is it possible in the future that these alternative theories were absolutely equally taught and learned?
Yeah, it's a good question. So the question about, first of all, about cranial capacity of Neanderthals, that's sort of been established for a long time that they have a larger cranial capacity than modern humans. And then the argument about that, well, first of all, you know, it's more about brain structure, right, than brain size. But then also they were much more robust than modern humans. So just as, you know, animals that are much larger than us often will have larger brains, you know, that you can't necessarily extrapolate. In terms of sort of interpreting burials and, you know, and thinking about these counter histories and that run in parallel where they're contested, I think, you know, many times it's not possible to really judge one or the other, you know, that you just have to accept that these things exist together in a space of possibility and that we can't make a decision one way or the other. Now, of course, in a forensic context, that's not good enough. If you're looking at a law court, you know, at a murder or something like that. But there, it's a very different kind of argument that you're making. You're trying to establish a very narrow range of events that took place rather than thinking more broadly about the sort of status and significance and social identity of an individual. So, you know, and generally when we make these kinds of arguments, I think this kind of indexical evidence is always the stake around which the argument is constructed. So when I showed you all those examples of the Neanderthals, all of those shifts in the way in which we're thinking about Neanderthals are all tied ultimately to these very small indexical traces, whether it's cut marks on bones or you know, starches in dental calculus. So it really, a lot of it just depends on whether those traces are there, those indexical traces are there, and then how they're interpreted, and whether there's even a framework within which they can be recognized. Yeah, I hope that answers the question.
Alternative histories?
Just to pick up on your example of Alexander the Great, though, I mean, Alexander the Great is an absolutely classic example, whereas in Western narratives, kind of, he is only Alexander the Great, but if you look in Persian and Iranian narratives, he is Alexander the Destroyer. Kind of, you know, he does exist in these multiple different impersonations, depending on the cultural perspective you are looking at him with. And I, for one, would welcome hugely much more of that multi-perspective teaching of history. It's quite interesting, I think, that the OECD that runs PISA, the Program for International Student Assessment, that looks across about 70 countries around the world and looks at school curriculums for sort of 15-year-olds and assesses how well those curricula are preparing students for their futures. In 2018, they added a new criteria to their assessment, which was global competency. How well are we preparing the generation of tomorrow to be able to engage in global cultural dialogue and interaction with different cultures? And I think that is where history can actually be extremely useful, that kind of, and particularly if it's a multiple perspective history.
Actually, Alexander is a very interesting case from the point of view of fantasy, because there's within not very long after his actual death, there was the Roman d'Alexandre, I call it that, but anyway, what's it called? Life of Alexander.
Alexandre Romance.
Yeah, the Alexandre Romance, which is an extraordinarily entertaining, actually, fiction, but presented as a history, as a life of Alexander. And he's a hero of the quest for knowledge in that book, because he goes down to the bottom of the sea and he rises up, he organizes a kind of balloon, not quite a balloon, a basket with griffins to try to take him up to the heavens. So there's a kind of, he moves from being a military, the emphasis is not on being military, but on actually being someone who seeks for wisdom. He's a wisdom hero.
So I turn, if you give us your name and your question.
Hi, my name is Barry, and I'm a recovering student. And I just want to ask you a quick question before I ask my main question. I'm getting back to education after 30 years, focusing on early childhood education. I've asked this to over 25 professors if they know the simple etymology of the word intelligence. None of them have known. I'm just curious if any of you do.
I think I do. Could you tell us?
Absolutely. I might have known this in the 3rd grade. You cut the word in half. The first syllable is intelle. That means between. The second half of the syllable is spelled L-E-G-E, and it's Latin R-E. Legere, which means to choose. Intelligence simply means to choose between. You're not using this till you're making a choice for yourself, because your whole life is about the choices you make. So,
Do you have a question?
Okay, now, this is my question. I did a master's thesis 30-odd years ago by mistake and coincidence called Toward a Theory of Visual Literacy or Visual Education. It was supposed to be the new emerging thing. And saying neurology has proven the way our minds work is basically the way our eyes work. So that's why you see, I see what you mean. I use my imagination. So when your eyes are open and moving, our minds evolved in a state of nature to track 7 streams of awareness simultaneously. That's why everything is like a system or a pattern, and the way our brain creates meaning is by creating and forming a pattern through the different parts and pieces. Now, a word puts your attention on one detail and pulls it out. So we're living, I think, like in a metaphor of Plato's cave, where we think the shadows on the wall are reality, and that's where everything is. But when you hear that nobody knew what a brain was until 15 years ago, and we're just discovering it, so does actually knowing how your brain works and develops have anything to do with the way education should be put?
Do you have a question?
Yes, I'm asking you if our minds operate in a visual way and we have a 7-point awareness and a word goes from 7 to 1 and it's just a name for an object or an image, what happens if you think about a visual-based literacy that has to do with the way our minds and brains actually operate, and that we're actually 7 times more creatively aware than we think we are because nobody knew what a brain was? I'm just asking you just what you think. I've been, whatever you think.
I wish I knew what I thought.
Zoe,
Unknowable.
You were shaking your head.
I think pattern recognition is really important to think about. And of course, it's not just visual pattern recognition, right? We have audio pattern recognition. There are many forms of pattern recognition. And that's really what we're doing in archaeology all the time, is looking for patterns in order to have some basis on which to make an argument, right? It's very difficult to extrapolate from one example. So I think there's a lot there to think about. And what's interesting about pattern recognition is that it tends to come to you quite immediately. When you see a pattern, it's almost like you almost see it as part of perception. You sort of recognize it in this moment where it's not necessarily kind of discursively examined. And so that I think pattern recognition can also be quite dangerous for the same reasons, right? In that you can recognize patterns that maybe don't exist. So, for example, thinking about racial categories in the US and the way in which people classify people in terms of race, which is biologically not really a meaningful concept. It's a sort of folk classification of people. So it's certainly an area that we really need to think about very carefully when we think about what it is to know something.
Well, thank you. So, yes.
Just like you I have a little video on YouTube called No Adults Left Behind, where inner city 5-year-olds talk about life with more understanding than most adults. So, thank you so much. I greatly appreciate your good sharing and help.
So, you've been waiting for a long time, sir, so please.
Thank you. You have to bend down like a Neanderthal here. Go like that, okay. Homo sapien. Thank you so much for this. This has been wonderful. And I'm so glad I know what I didn't know before I came here today about unknowability. And I think I got this phrase actually from Lacan, which is, people don't know what they don't know. My name is John Braden. I'm an educator, and I also host a TV show and podcast on culture and ideas called the Public Voice Salon. I was at a party last night. I was talking to a woman with a background in communications, right? And I'm trying to talk to her, and I realized I couldn't communicate at all with this person with this degree in communications, working in communications. I was thinking, it made me think about Marcuse, where he talks about how the logic of the market sort of infiltrates us and how we talk. And this woman, she was talking in like sentences that were marching.
Moving towards a question here?
Yes, it's moving towards a question, yeah. Sometimes you need to say things to get towards a question, right? So that's what this is. And in terms of education, one of our recent guests on our show is Diane Ravitch, who is a critic of our educational systems and this focus on standardized testing, which is squeezing out literature and history in your fields, right, in this country. This obsessive focus on filling in the bubble sheets and testing and reading and mathematics. So how do people know what they don't know if people don't know literature, history, and have imagination? And we're in such a polarized situation in our country now where each side claims the other side is wrong and they're absolutely right, and yet you have this deficit in our educational system where people are not getting literature and history. So how would you, my question is, what are your thoughts about that? About the question between education and your topic here, right?
Yeah, I mean, we have exactly the same problem in the UK, that what we call STEM subjects, science, technology, and mathematics, are kind of getting priority in the curriculum, and particularly within the state, the public school system. There is less and less time for subjects such as history. My description of it all is that you can talk about science and technology and et cetera, all you like, and that gives you the sum of our human parts, but that we are always more than the sum of our parts. And that extra factor, if you like, is where the humanities sits. And if you don't kind of engage with that extra factor, then you're missing something out, which is so key to humanity itself.
Yeah. You want to say something?
Yes, I'd like to say that I think it's the ground in which we form the values that form the questions that we ask science and technology. I don't think science and technology can actually approach its own questions if it doesn't have, if the practitioners don't have a really solid grounding in thinking about, what a whole human being is. It's your point, but about ethics. I mean, if you think of the medical sciences, for example, they're absolutely grounded in philosophical ethics. And philosophical ethics themselves are formed by chronicles that can be either fictional or historical, but are chronicles of how human beings have behaved. I mean, if you think of a question like, well, I don't even want to go into the sort of difficult, they're so sensitive, these questions, but there are just in medical ethics in particular, but it's also true of even mathematics. The mathematics will eventually lead to some kind of knowledge of applications, and that matters, how we value that, what we're going to do with that knowledge. Robotics.
We're coming towards the end of our time, and I see two people with questions. I assume you have a question. What I'd like to do is invite you each to come to the microphone, say who you are, and ask your question. And then, you ask, and then I'll turn it back to the panel to wrap it up. So please, if you could come forward.
Hi, my name is Yanko, and I have a question for Professor Scott. I guess the question will be, what kind of professor what kind of historian are you? I guess rather a fundamental question. I guess Lord Macaulay would consider it a historian as somebody who combines fiction and imagination, and there'll be other historian like Flack, who would consider language comes first. So when person think about something that creates knowledge, so knower comes first, then knowledge. Or you could consider it as there is something outside of human being that you cannot know, therefore we can only approach to that knowledge. Or you could also consider, I don't know, Richard Kuhn, who would consider community forms of knowledge, and a group of people actually, as a historian or a group of people would form the knowledge together and affirm each other's facts or something like that. So I guess I didn't quite do my homework and didn't read any of your writings, so I don't really know. So if you can either refer me to some sort of writing that you have done, or you could just quickly explain it to us.
Thanks very much. That's a wonderful question. And before, though, I give you a chance to answer it, I'd like to hear your question, please. And
Yes, my name is Barbara. Neither my hearing nor the acoustics are wonderful, so I'm not sure I'm addressing something that wasn't already addressed or that's appropriate. But I find the literature of the nonsense so delightful. But I've always felt that underneath there's some purpose in nonsense. And I don't think you addressed that, but maybe you did.
Don't worry. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. That's another very good question. So I'll go back to you. Yeah, what kind of historian are you?
Interestingly, so I think I'm a historian particularly of the ancient world, right? And I think ancient historians are an odd breed. I was discussing this with Zoe that I'm a historian who positively sees us needing to take both the literary sources that survive as well as the material archaeological sources and every other kind of source we've got to try and bring it together to offer a 360-degree picture as best we can of the ancient world. I see kind of ancient studies as a form of sociology, right? We are interested in understanding what made these ancient societies tick, and that's a little bit about the stories they told themselves, and thus I am less concerned about truth and falsity, fact and fiction, as much as I am concerned and interested in the fact that these are the stories that they are surrounding themselves with, and what does that tell us about these people as a culture as a whole. So I don't know which category I thus fall into, but that would be kind of my take on history.
Yeah, so.
Well, I think one of the purposes is delight. So I'm very happy that you said you were delighted. But I think that delight does have a deeper purpose, which is that it is a form of freedom because it's a kind of refusal. And it can be disruptive of what we've been talking about, imposed institutional narratives. And because it's sort of rebellious in its meaninglessness, it does actually, I mean, especially with Dada, but I think now too, and there's been a bit of a revival of it, of nonsense making. And it has a purpose to unsettle and destabilize hegemonic kind of impositions. It's a way of, the irreverence in it is a statement of liberty.
Well, on that note, I'm almost tempted to reconvene shortly with a rerun of Cabaret Voltaire, but we haven't rehearsed. The conference, however, does go on. We're going to take a break briefly. But at 6 o'clock, John Barrow is going to be giving the keynote event of this conference here in this room. And I hope that all of you will be back to listen to what I'm sure will be a very interesting address. Thank you all for coming out.